"You'll never be my wife," he said coldly. 2 years later, he saw her with the twins, and his world collapsed. Michael Blackstone had spent his life learning how to harden his heart, to treat emotions as weaknesses that could derail his rise to power. From the very beginning of his career he had built his reputation on cold decisiveness, on the ability to walk away from anything or anyone who threatened to distract him from his goals. By the time he was 35, he was the celebrated CEO of a corporation that stretched across industries, his name whispered with a mixture of fear and admiration in the highest circles of business. He had the kind of wealth that made him untouchable, the kind of authority that bent others to his will, and yet the more he achieved, the more ruthless he became, as though every victory demanded he prove again that nothing, not love, not friendship, not loyalty, could weigh him down. Julia had been one of the few people who ever glimpsed the man beneath the steel exterior. She was his assistant, intelligent and capable, but unlike others around him she did not flatter or scheme for favors. She looked him in the eye when she spoke, challenged him when he was unreasonable, and carried herself with quiet dignity that no amount of money could purchase. Over months of working late nights together, their relationship had shifted in ways neither acknowledged aloud. She had seen him smile when he forgot himself, she had felt the warmth of his hand brush hers when passing files, she had caught the rare moments of exhaustion in his expression when he thought no one was watching. For Julia, who had guarded her heart carefully, the realization that she had fallen in love with him was both terrifying and exhilarating. One evening, after another long day that bled into night, she gathered the courage to confess. The office was nearly empty, the glow of city lights flooding through the floor-to-ceiling windows, and the silence between them was heavier than usual. Julia stood by his desk, her hands trembling slightly as she told him that she cared for him, not as her boss but as a man, that she saw more in him than the world did, and that she dreamed of a future where he could let down the walls he had built so high. Her voice wavered but her gaze remained steady, her brown eyes shimmering with sincerity. Michael leaned back in his chair, studying her as though she were a problem to be solved rather than a woman bearing her soul. For a long moment he said nothing, and Julia's heart hammered with hope and fear. Then, in a tone colder than the glass and steel towers that surrounded them, he let out a short, humorless laugh and said the words that would change both of their lives, "You will never be my wife." The sentence cut through the air like a blade. Julia felt her breath catch, her body stiffening as though the floor had given way beneath her. His expression remained detached, as though he were delivering a quarterly report rather than destroying her heart. He had not shouted, had not insulted her, but the dismissiveness in his voice carried more cruelty than anger ever could. He turned back to the papers on his desk as though the matter were settled, as though her confession had been nothing more than an inconvenience. Julia left the office that night without another word, her heels clicking against the marble floor in a rhythm that echoed her breaking resolve. She did not wait for him to call after her because she knew he would not. She did not allow herself to cry until she reached the solitude of her apartment, where the tears came hot and endless. The image of him, seated in his immaculate suit, dismissing her dreams with a smirk, replayed in her mind until exhaustion finally forced her into restless sleep. For Michael, the moment barely registered. He poured himself a drink, reviewed the next day's agenda, and convinced himself that he had done the right thing. Marriage, love, family, those were chains, and he was destined for freedom. He did not notice the silence that lingered in the office after Julia stopped coming in early or staying late, nor did he allow himself to wonder why his mornings felt heavier without her cheerful greetings. He buried the memory of her confession as quickly as it had occurred, filing it away in the drawer of regrets he refused to acknowledge. What neither of them knew was that the night Julia walked away was not the end of their story, but the beginning of something neither could have imagined, a journey that would test them in ways power and pride could never prepare them for. Julia left the city only a few weeks after that devastating night, carrying with her not just the sting of rejection but the determination to rebuild her life far from Michael Blackstone's shadow. The towering skyscrapers that once seemed full of promise now felt suffocating, their glass facades reflecting her broken hopes back at her with cruel clarity. She packed what little she owned into 2 battered suitcases and boarded a bus headed to a town she had never visited, drawn only by its distance from the world she wanted to forget. The journey was long and silent, filled with the rumble of the road and the echo of Michael's words playing endlessly in her mind. "You will never be my wife" had become a scar she could not erase, but beneath the pain burned a quiet flame of resilience. She refused to let that moment define her future. In the small town where she eventually settled, life was nothing like the dazzling pace of New York. The streets were narrow and lined with family-owned shops, the air carried the smell of fresh bread and wood smoke, and people smiled at strangers instead of brushing past them. Julia rented a modest apartment above a laundromat, its walls thin and its furnishings sparse, but to her it was a sanctuary where she could breathe again. She found work as a waitress in a local diner, a job that left her exhausted but gave her just enough money to survive. Each day she tied her hair back, slipped into a faded uniform, and smiled at customers even when her heart was heavy. The tips barely covered rent and groceries, but for the first time in months she began to believe she could start over. It was during those first fragile weeks that Julia's world shifted once again. She had been feeling unwell, dizzy spells and waves of nausea interrupting her shifts, but she blamed it on stress and exhaustion. When the symptoms persisted, she finally went to the small-town clinic. Sitting in the sterile room, clutching the edge of the chair, she heard the words that made her heart pound with a mixture of fear and awe: she was pregnant. And not with one child, she was carrying twins. The news left her reeling. The image of Michael's cold, dismissive face rose immediately in her mind, and for a moment she felt her knees go weak. How could she raise 2 children alone when she could barely take care of herself? Panic surged through her, but just as quickly it was replaced by something stronger. She placed her hand on her stomach, tears filling her eyes, and whispered a promise to the lives growing inside her. She would not let them suffer for his mistakes. She would love them enough for both parents. The months that followed were some of the hardest of her life. Pregnancy took a heavy toll on her body. Her feet swelled after long shifts at the diner, her back ached constantly, and she fought through morning sickness that lasted well into the evenings. Still, she kept working, every dollar carefully stretched to cover food and doctor visits. At night she sat alone in her small apartment, rubbing her growing belly and speaking softly to her unborn children, telling them stories about the world they would one day see. She described the kindness of the bakery owner downstairs, the bright colors of the autumn leaves, the songs she hummed as she cleaned tables at the diner. She promised them that although their father had turned his back, they would never feel unloved. Loneliness often pressed in like a weight she could not lift, especially when she saw other families together in the diner, fathers lifting their children onto their laps, mothers smiling as they shared meals. Julia would excuse herself to the back room, pressing a hand to her stomach and willing herself not to cry. But every time the despair threatened to consume her, the twins reminded her of their presence with small kicks and flutters that filled her with renewed strength. She began to think of them as her secret guardians, tiny souls pushing her forward when she felt weakest. By the time her due date approached, Julia had grown used to surviving on very little sleep and even less money, but her spirit had become unbreakable. She no longer dwelled on Michael's rejection with the same raw pain. Instead, she focused on the future she was about to hold in her arms. The fear remained, fear of the unknown, of raising 2 children alone, of failing them, but beneath it all was a fierce love that nothing could shake. The night before she went into labor, Julia stood by the small window of her apartment, looking out at the quiet street below. The snow was beginning to fall, blanketing the town in silence. She placed both hands on her swollen belly and whispered once more, promising her children that they would never know the emptiness of abandonment. She vowed that whatever the world demanded of her, she would give it, and she would never let them doubt that they were wanted. As the snow drifted down, she felt a deep calm settle over her. She was no longer just a woman abandoned by a powerful man. She was a mother, and soon she would meet the two souls who would give her life a meaning she had never known. The day Julia went into labor began with an icy wind rattling the windows of her small apartment. She woke before dawn, her body heavy and aching, the dull pain in her back unlike anything she had felt before. At first she tried to convince herself it was just another restless night, but soon the pain sharpened into waves that stole her breath and forced her to grip the edge of the bed until her knuckles turned white. Panic set in for a brief moment, the realization that she was alone crashing over her, but she forced herself to breathe steadily. She had prepared for this, rehearsed the walk to the phone, rehearsed the call to the neighbor who had promised to drive her to the hospital when the time came. By the time the sun had risen, she was in the back of a beat-up sedan, the snow falling thick and silent around them as the driver rushed her through nearly empty streets. The hospital was small, nothing like the gleaming facilities she had visited in New York during company health checkups, but the nurses greeted her with brisk kindness, their voices steady, their hands confident as they guided her through the whirlwind of paperwork and preparation. Hours stretched into a blur of pain and exhaustion, but through it all Julia held on to the thought of the two little lives fighting their way into the world. When the cries finally filled the room, first one piercing and insistent, then another joining moments later, her tears fell freely, not from pain but from overwhelming relief. They placed the first baby in her arms, a tiny girl with shockingly dark hair plastered against her damp forehead, her blue eyes opening briefly before squeezing shut again. Then came the second, equally small, equally fragile, her features so similar it was as if Julia were looking at a mirror split in two. She whispered their names, Lily and Sophia, her voice shaking with wonder. The following days were a haze of sleepless nights, bottles, and endless worry. Julia sat in the narrow hospital bed, holding both girls close against her chest, marveling at how something so small could carry the weight of her entire existence. She traced their tiny fingers, their perfect eyelids, their soft curls, and with each breath they took she felt her own life expand beyond anything she had ever imagined. She knew the road ahead would not be easy, but in that moment she understood what it meant to love without condition. She promised them silently that she would never let them feel unwanted, that she would shield them from the pain she had known. When they were finally released from the hospital, Julia bundled the girls in second-hand blankets and carried them carefully into the cold air. The apartment felt even smaller now, crowded by bassinets and the endless necessities of infants, but she found comfort in the sound of their breathing, in the way their presence filled the silence that had once seemed unbearable. Nights were long and grueling, with feedings every few hours, her body still aching from the strain of childbirth, yet every time she looked down at her daughters she felt a surge of strength she did not know she possessed. Exhaustion became her constant companion, but so did joy, woven tightly together in the fabric of her new life. As months passed, Julia learned the rhythms of motherhood. She learned that Lily cried louder and demanded attention with fiery persistence, while Sophia was quieter, her gaze deep and thoughtful even as a baby. She learned how to stretch her small income, buying only what was absolutely necessary, often skipping meals herself to ensure the girls had everything they needed. She learned to smile through her fatigue at the diner, to endure the pitying looks of customers who noticed her thin frame and tired eyes, because she carried with her the secret pride of knowing she was raising two miracles on her own. Loneliness remained, a shadow that followed her through the days, but it was softened by the laughter that slowly began to fill her home. When Lily and Sophia learned to roll over, she clapped until tears blurred her vision. When they giggled for the first time, she laughed with them, her heart swelling until it felt too large for her chest. Every milestone became a victory, proof that despite the odds, they were thriving. Sometimes, when she rocked them to sleep in the dim light of the apartment, she allowed herself to imagine what it might have been like if things had been different, if Michael had chosen to stay, if he had been there to see his daughter's first smiles. But those thoughts only deepened the ache inside her, so she forced them away, focusing instead on the warm weight of her children in her arms. 2 years slipped by in this way, a blur of struggle and love. Julia grew thinner but stronger, her hands rough from endless work but steady when she buttoned tiny coats or braided wisps of dark hair. Lily and Sophia grew into curious toddlers, their blue eyes bright and mischievous, their bond inseparable as they played and fought and laughed in the same breath. They filled every corner of the apartment with life, their voices echoing through the thin walls, their presence turning even the hardest days into something bearable. Julia sometimes wondered how she had managed to survive without them before, and she could not imagine a world in which they did not exist. Yet beneath the joy lingered a quiet fear, one she never voiced even to herself. She knew the day would come when her daughters would ask about their father, when they would look at their reflection in the mirror and wonder whose features they carried. And when that day came, Julia would have to decide how much of the truth to tell. For now, she pushed the thought aside, holding onto the fragile piece she had carved out of pain, unaware that fate was already moving to shatter the fragile distance between her new life and the past she had tried so hard to bury. Michael Blackstone's empire had grown larger than even he once imagined, his name etched into skyscrapers, his face plastered across magazines that hailed him as one of the most brilliant and ruthless business minds of his generation. He had more money than he could ever spend, more influence than many politicians, and yet the higher he climbed, the heavier the emptiness inside him became. He attended glittering galas where crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead and champagne flowed endlessly, yet he always found himself drifting toward the edges of the crowd, detached from the laughter and false admiration that surrounded him. The women he entertained were beautiful, polished, and eager to be seen at his side, but their voices blurred together, their presence leaving him with nothing but a deeper sense of isolation when the nights were over. In the quiet moments, when the city lights stretched endlessly beneath his penthouse windows, the silence pressed in on him until it became unbearable. It was in those hours of solitude that his thoughts betrayed him, circling back to the one woman he had tried to erase from his memory. Julia's face came unbidden into his mind, the way her brown eyes had looked at him with both strength and vulnerability when she told him she loved him, the way her voice had trembled with hope, the way he had crushed that hope with a single cruel sentence. He tried to push the memory away, burying himself in work, telling himself she was insignificant, that she had probably forgotten him entirely. But her image refused to fade. Sometimes, when he saw a woman in the street with her hair catching the sunlight, or when he heard a laugh that carried the same lightness hers once had, the ache inside him deepened until it left him restless and angry at himself for even caring. He told himself he had made the right decision, that love and marriage were chains that would have bound him, distracted him, weakened him. Yet the conviction that once fueled his ambition had begun to crumble. Board meetings felt hollow, each new acquisition failing to bring the thrill it once had. His colleagues noticed the change, mistaking his detachment for arrogance, but Michael knew it was something deeper. It was as if every success only highlighted the absence of something more meaningful, something he had once held in his hands and thrown away. At night, when he closed his eyes, he sometimes imagined what her life might look like now. He pictured her walking down unfamiliar streets, maybe holding a child's hand, maybe laughing with someone else who had given her the devotion he had denied her. The thought unsettled him in ways he did not want to admit. He had always prided himself on control, on never regretting his choices, but Julia had become the ghost that haunted him, not with anger or bitterness, but with the relentless question of what might have been if he had chosen differently. The emptiness grew sharper when he visited his sister one weekend. She had 2 young children who greeted him at the door with sticky hands and squeals of laughter, climbing into his lap as if he were the most important person in their world. At first, he had laughed awkwardly, trying to hide his discomfort, but as the evening wore on, he found himself staring at them with a kind of yearning he could not explain. Their innocence disarmed him, their trust unsettled him, and when he left that night, their faces followed him all the way back to his penthouse. For the first time, he began to question whether the empire he had built was enough to fill the hollow space inside him. Yet he never sought Julia out. Pride held him back, and so did fear, the fear that if he found her, he would discover she had moved on, that she was happy without him, that his absence had left no mark on her life. He convinced himself it was better not to know, better to continue living in the world he had constructed, even if it felt like a cage of his own making. Still, the gnawing ache persisted, a reminder that the man the world saw as invincible was, in truth, haunted by a single woman he had believed too easy to discard. As he stood in his office one evening, the skyline burning with the glow of sunset, Michael caught his reflection in the glass and barely recognized the man staring back at him. He saw the tailored suit, the hardened jaw, the icy eyes that intimidated entire boardrooms, but behind it all was a weariness he could not hide. For years he had told himself he was free because he had no ties, no weaknesses. Now he realized that freedom without love, without connection, was nothing more than emptiness dressed in gold. And somewhere, though he did not know where, Julia was living a life that no longer included him. The knowledge left him hollow, unaware that fate was already weaving their paths back together, preparing to confront him with the truth he had been running from for years. Michael had traveled to the small town on what was supposed to be a routine business trip, another ribbon-cutting ceremony for one of his company's expanding branches. He stepped out of the sleek black car in his usual immaculate light gray suit, the one tailored to perfection, every stitch designed to convey authority and control. His assistant briefed him on the schedule as photographers prepared to capture his practiced smile, but Michael's mind was elsewhere. He was weary from the endless cycle of contracts and press events, and the only reason he had agreed to attend personally was because the new branch was expected to become a cornerstone of the company's future. He intended to get through the day quickly, give a speech, shake a few hands, and return to the anonymity of the city where he could bury himself in work once more. The air in the small town felt different from what he was used to, sharp and fresh with the faint scent of blooming trees. As he walked down the main street toward the cafe where a meeting was scheduled with local investors, he noticed how people greeted each other by name, how they lingered to talk instead of rushing by. It was a world far removed from the polished but impersonal life he led. He was about to dismiss the observation as trivial when he heard it, laughter, high-pitched and bubbling, carrying through the air like music. It made him pause. There was something disarming in that sound, something that tugged at him in a way he couldn't immediately explain. He turned toward the source and saw them. A young woman stepped out of the cafe, holding the hands of two small children. For a moment his mind refused to believe what his eyes were showing him. The woman's dark brown hair caught the sunlight, her familiar profile so achingly recognizable that it knocked the breath out of him. Julia. She looked older, stronger, her posture more determined than he remembered, but her eyes, the deep brown eyes that had once searched his face for something he had refused to give, were the same. His chest tightened as though the air itself had turned to stone. Then his gaze dropped to the girls. They couldn't have been older than 2. Both had soft dark hair and the unmistakable blue eyes he saw every morning in his own reflection. They clung to Julia's hands with the ease of children who trusted her completely, their laughter ringing through the air as they pointed at something in the window display. In that instant, realization hit him like a physical blow. They were his. He didn't need a test, didn't need anyone to explain. The truth was etched in their faces, undeniable and merciless. The daughters he never knew existed were walking before him, alive, beautiful, and utterly foreign to the world he inhabited. Michael stood frozen, his carefully constructed composure crumbling. Memories flooded back, the night Julia confessed her love, the cruel words he had thrown at her, the way she had walked out of his life without looking back. He had convinced himself she had forgotten him, that she had moved on. Yet here she was, and she had not only moved on but had carried with her the greatest secret of his life. He felt an ache in his chest so sharp it bordered on pain, a mixture of shock, guilt, and something dangerously close to longing. Julia's eyes met his then. For a fleeting moment time seemed to stop, the noise of the street fading until there was only the weight of her gaze. He saw recognition flash across her face, followed by something darker, anger, mistrust, the instinct to protect. She immediately tightened her grip on the girl's hands and drew them closer, her body subtly positioning itself between him and them. It was a gesture so natural yet so damning that it made his stomach twist. She was shielding them from him, as though he were a threat rather than their father. Michael took a step forward, his lips parting to speak, but the words caught in his throat. What could he possibly say? How could he ask for forgiveness when he had been absent for their entire lives? He wanted to kneel before the girls, to trace the curls of their hair, to hear their voices up close, but the barrier of Julia's cold stare kept him rooted where he was. For the first time in years, the man who had commanded boardrooms and empires found himself powerless, undone by two tiny children and the woman who had once trusted him with her heart. Julia did not linger. With a final glance, sharp as glass, she turned and guided the girls away, her back straight and unyielding. Michael stood on the sidewalk, his entire world tilting beneath him as he watched them disappear into the crowd. Every instinct screamed at him to follow, to demand answers, but another part of him knew this was not a confrontation that could be resolved with power or wealth. He had seen the truth, and the truth was devastating. He was a father. He had missed their first steps, their first words, the warmth of their little arms around his neck, all because he had chosen arrogance over love. As the noise of the town returned and his assistant hurried up with a tablet full of schedules, Michael barely heard a word. His mind was no longer on the expansion of his empire, nor on the investors waiting in the cafe. His entire being was consumed by the image of Julia with the girls, the life she had built without him, and the brutal certainty that he had lost years he could never reclaim. For the first time in his life, he felt fear, not of failure in business, but of the possibility that he might never be allowed into the world of the children who carried his eyes and his blood. That night, alone in his hotel room, Michael sat in the dark staring at his reflection in the window. The city outside was smaller than the one he had left behind, but it carried a weight he could not ignore. He pressed his hands to his face, feeling the sting of regret wash over him, and whispered to himself a truth he could no longer deny. He had been wrong. He had been cruel. And now, unless he could find a way to change, he risked losing the only thing that had ever truly mattered. The following days became unbearable for Michael, his mind consumed with the image of Julia and the two little girls whose blue eyes mirrored his own. He had thought himself prepared for every kind of challenge, every hostile takeover, every betrayal in business, but nothing had armed him for the crushing weight of seeing his daughters for the first time and realizing how much of their lives he had already missed. He found himself wandering the streets of the small town instead of attending meetings, scanning every cafe and park in hopes of catching another glimpse of them. His assistant grew nervous, shuffling schedules and fielding calls from furious board members, but Michael ignored it all. For the first time, he had something more important than business. When he finally saw Julia again, it was outside the same cafe. She had one of the girls on her hip while the other toddled beside her, clinging to her cardigan with chubby fingers. Michael approached cautiously, his heart hammering in a way he had never experienced in boardrooms or negotiations. Julia spotted him immediately, her expression hardening into a wall of suspicion and protectiveness. She shifted the child on her hip and angled her body so that both girls were behind her, her eyes narrowing as he drew closer. He stopped a few feet away, afraid that if he pushed too far, she would vanish again. For a moment they simply stared at each other, the silence filled with all the words left unsaid over the years. "I'm not here to take them from you," Michael finally said, his voice low and unsteady. It shocked him to hear the tremor in his own words, a vulnerability he hadn't shown anyone in years. Julia's lips tightened, but she said nothing, her gaze burning into him like fire. He wanted to explain, to beg, to tell her he hadn't known, but every excuse he tried to form died on his tongue. She turned abruptly, leading the girls away without responding, leaving him standing there in the middle of the street like a man stripped of everything. Michael didn't give up. He began appearing in quiet, unobtrusive ways. When Julia struggled to carry groceries, he was the one who quietly paid the bill before she reached the register. When he learned through whispers in town that one of the girls had fallen ill, he anonymously covered the hospital expenses, ensuring she had the best care the clinic could provide. He never announced himself, never demanded gratitude, but Julia wasn't foolish. She knew exactly who was behind it. Every time she saw him standing at a distance, watching with an expression that carried more regret than pride, she felt her defenses shake just slightly, though she refused to let him see it. The girls, however, noticed him in their own innocent way. One afternoon in the park, Lily, the more spirited of the twins, spotted Michael sitting alone on a bench. She toddled over, clutching a small toy in her hand, and stared up at him with those piercing blue eyes. For a moment Michael froze, terrified to move, but then she held out the toy as if offering it to him. His chest tightened painfully as he accepted it with trembling hands. Julia rushed forward, scooping Lily up, her eyes blazing with warning. Yet the moment lingered in Michael's heart, the first wordless connection between him and the daughter who didn't yet know who he was. In the weeks that followed, Michael found himself transformed. He canceled business trips, redirected meetings to his hotel in the town, and ignored the protests of his shareholders. He spent hours simply walking the same streets Julia did, not to stalk her but to prove he wasn't running away. He wanted her to see that he was staying, that he was willing to be present even if she hated him. Slowly, small cracks began to show in Julia's armor. She still kept her distance, but she no longer whisked the girls away at the first sight of him. Sometimes she allowed them to play in the park while he watched from across the lawn, his eyes never leaving them. The turning point came one rainy evening when Julia was caught outside with the girls, struggling to shield them with a thin umbrella as the downpour soaked through their clothes. Michael appeared suddenly, his car pulling to the curb, and without a word he stepped out, his jacket already in his hands. He draped it around the shivering children, his movements gentle and hesitant, as though afraid they might break. For the first time, Julia didn't push him away. She looked at him with a mix of exhaustion and something softer, something dangerously close to the trust she had once given him. That night, as he watched her carry the girls up the stairs to their apartment, he realized that actions, not words, would be the only way to earn his place in their lives. He couldn't undo the years he had missed, couldn't erase the cruelty of his rejection, but he could prove, day by day, that he was no longer the man who had once valued pride above love. And though Julia still locked her door against him, though she still guarded her daughters with fierce determination, Michael knew he had taken the first step toward redemption. It was a bitterly cold night when Julia woke to the sound of coughing from the small bedroom where her daughters slept. At first she thought it was nothing more than a restless dream, but when the cough grew harsher and she heard the ragged sound of shallow breathing, panic surged through her. She rushed into the room and found Sophia curled up in bed, her little face flushed with fever, her tiny chest heaving with every labored breath. Julia's heart pounded as she scooped the child into her arms, whispering soothing words that did nothing to calm the terror clawing at her throat. Lily stirred in the other bed, frightened by the noise, and Julia had to force herself to stay steady, to mask her fear for the sake of both girls. The small-town clinic was a blur of bright lights and hurried footsteps, doctors and nurses moving quickly as Julia clutched Sophia's hand and tried to answer questions through her tears. They spoke of infection, of complications that could worsen without immediate treatment, of the need for expensive medication and overnight monitoring. Julia felt her stomach drop when she saw the bill, the numbers swimming before her eyes as she realized she could never afford it. She tried to ask about payment plans, about alternatives, but the doctor's expression told her everything. Without immediate care, her daughter's condition could spiral into something far worse. Julia sat in the hallway outside the examination room, her head in her hands, trembling with exhaustion and despair. She thought of calling friends, but she had none close enough to lean on. She thought of selling what little she owned, but even then it would not be enough. For the first time since the twins were born, she felt truly helpless, crushed by the weight of her own limitations. She had promised her daughters she would always protect them, and now, when it mattered most, she felt she was failing. When Michael arrived at the clinic, she almost didn't recognize him. He appeared suddenly, striding down the hall with urgency in his step, his hair slightly disheveled as though he had left wherever he was without hesitation. She opened her mouth to speak, but he didn't give her the chance. He went straight to the reception desk, asked for the doctor by name, and within minutes had arranged everything. He authorized the medication, covered the overnight care, and demanded that Sophia be given the best attention the clinic could provide. Julia stood frozen, caught between fury and relief, her pride screaming at her to push him away even as her heart swelled with gratitude she didn't want to admit. Later, when she entered the room, she found him sitting by Sophia's bed. The little girl's small hand was cradled gently in his much larger one, and he was murmuring words she couldn't quite hear, his head bowed in a posture of raw vulnerability she had never seen from him. There were tears in his eyes, real, unguarded tears, that slipped down his face as he begged the child silently to be strong. Julia lingered in the doorway, shaken to her core. The man she remembered, the one who had smirked at her love and dismissed her dreams, had never shown weakness, never allowed emotion to breach the surface. Yet here he was, stripped of arrogance, stripped of power, nothing more than a father terrified of losing the child he had only just found. The hours crawled by slowly, filled with the steady beeping of monitors and the hushed voices of nurses. Michael never moved from the chair, never let go of Sophia's hand, not even when Julia told him he should rest. He refused food, refused water, his entire focus locked on the fragile little girl in the bed. Julia finally sat down across from him, too exhausted to argue, watching him as he watched their daughter. In that silence something shifted, not in words but in the undeniable truth of his actions. When morning came, Sophia's fever broke. Her breathing eased, her cheeks lost some of their alarming redness, and the doctor declared her out of danger. Relief washed over Julia so powerfully she nearly collapsed, tears spilling freely as she kissed her daughter's forehead. She glanced across the bed at Michael, and for the first time in years their eyes met without anger or bitterness. In that look was a shared gratitude, a recognition of how close they had come to losing everything, and an unspoken acknowledgement that he had been there when it mattered most. Julia knew she could not erase the past. She still remembered the pain of his rejection, the lonely nights when she had wondered how she would manage, the bitterness that had kept her walls high and her heart closed. But she also knew she could not deny what she had witnessed. Michael had stayed, not as a CEO, not as a millionaire, but as a father desperate to save his daughter. He had shown her a side of himself she never thought existed, and in that moment, a seed of trust, small and fragile, began to take root once more. As the three of them left the clinic together later that day, Sophia held tightly to both her mother's and her father's hands, while Lily ran ahead, laughing in the crisp morning air. For the first time, they moved not as two people divided by pride and pain, but as something closer to a family. And though Julia told herself she still had reasons to guard her heart, she could not deny the hope rising quietly within her that perhaps change was possible, and that the man who had once broken her could also be the one to help heal what remained. The weeks that followed Sophia's recovery carried a weight of change that Julia could not deny, no matter how much she tried to guard herself. Michael was still present, but not in the way he once had been in her life, towering above her as a man of power who could dismiss her with a single word. He came quietly now, without the arrogance of his wealth, without the distance of his status. She saw him kneeling in the grass beside the twins, letting them braid his hair with clumsy little hands, chasing after them in the park until his tailored suit was stained with grass and dirt. She saw him at the grocery store, filling her cart without asking, his expression calm and steady when she protested, his voice saying only that she had carried the burden alone for too long. She saw him sitting across from her at the diner where she worked, drinking black coffee and waiting until her shift ended, not with impatience but with the kind of patience that had never belonged to the man she once knew. Julia resisted him at first, clinging to the anger that had protected her for years. Every smile from him felt like a temptation to lower her guard, every act of kindness a reminder of the man she had loved and lost. But anger had always been easier to hold than hope, and she realized with each passing day that her walls were beginning to crack. It was not his money that softened her, she had lived without it for years, and she would have continued to do so. It was the way he looked at their daughters as though they were the center of his universe, the way his eyes filled with unguarded love every time one of them laughed or reached for him. He had changed, not with promises or grand speeches, but with quiet persistence, with the humility to stay and prove himself in the smallest, most human of ways. The moment that altered everything came on a late spring afternoon, when Julia returned to the apartment to find Michael sitting on the floor surrounded by the twins. Lily had fallen asleep against his chest, her tiny fist still clutching his tie, while Sophia carefully held a book open, pretending to read aloud though she barely knew the words. Michael looked up as Julia entered, his expression so gentle and unguarded that she felt something inside her break. She realized then that he was no longer the man who had once told her she would never be his wife. That man had been consumed by pride and fear, unable to see beyond his own ambitions. The man before her was different, he was broken in the right places, rebuilt by regret and love, softened by the weight of what he had lost. That night, after the girls had been tucked into bed, Michael asked her to step outside. The street was quiet, the sky washed with the fading colors of sunset, and for a long time he said nothing, as though struggling to find words that could carry the enormity of what he felt. Finally, he turned to her, his hands trembling slightly, and confessed the truth that had haunted him since the moment he first saw her again. He told her how he had been wrong, how arrogance and fear had blinded him, how not a single achievement in his empire had filled the emptiness her absence had left. He told her how seeing their daughters had broken him open, how every day since had been a gift he did not deserve but was desperate to keep. His voice cracked as he admitted he could not undo the past, but he wanted to spend the rest of his life proving he had changed, proving he could be the man she and their children deserved. Then, to Julia's astonishment, Michael knelt on the rough pavement, not in the polished elegance of a boardroom but in the simplicity of the street where her life had unfolded without him. His eyes were wet, his voice unsteady, and he said that while she had once been his assistant, she had always been more. She had been his compass, his anchor, the only person who had ever seen him as more than money and power. He told her she had already been his wife in his heart long before he had realized it, and he begged her to let him make it real, to allow him the chance to be not just a father but her partner, her equal, her husband. Julia stood frozen, tears blurring her vision. She remembered the night he had dismissed her love with cruelty, the years of loneliness, the countless sacrifices she had made alone. She thought of the promises she had whispered to her daughters when they were still growing inside her, promises that she would never let them feel unwanted. And then she looked at Michael, on his knees, stripped of pride, stripped of arrogance, offering not wealth or power but himself, raw and flawed and utterly sincere. In that moment she understood that forgiveness did not mean forgetting, but it meant choosing to believe that people could change, that love could grow even from the ashes of heartbreak. She did not speak at first. Instead, she stepped forward and lifted him from the ground, her hand trembling as she touched his cheek. His breath caught, his blue eyes searching hers, and then she whispered the word he had not dared to hope for, yes. The relief that broke across his face was almost too much to bear, and when he pulled her into his arms, she felt for the first time in years that she was no longer carrying the weight of the world alone. The following morning, when the twins woke to find their parents together, their laughter filled the apartment with a joy that erased every shadow of the past. For Michael, it was the sound of redemption, the proof that love could triumph over pride, that the mistakes of yesterday could be transformed into the hope of tomorrow. And for Julia, it was the sound of healing, the realization that the family she had once believed impossible was now real, whole, and stronger than she had ever dared to imagine.
The billionaire's airport shock. A past reappears, with a child in tow. Hook. No way. Daniel Brooks froze. A few feet away, in the bustling airport terminal, stood Amelia Green. His ex. The woman who vanished from his life without explanation 3 years ago. But she wasn't alone. In her arms, she held a small child, bundled in a blue bare-eared coat. Daniel's breath hitched. It couldn't be. He'd recognize her anywhere, even with slightly longer hair and a sharper jawline. Her expression was tense, as if on high alert, trying to pass unnoticed. He took a step towards her. Amelia looked up, and their eyes met. For an instant, everything seemed to stop. Daniel saw fear on her face, but before he could react, she averted her gaze and quickened her pace. "Amelia!" he tried to call out, but the airport noise drowned his voice. He pushed forward, dodging passengers with luggage, ignoring the blare of boarding announcements. He couldn't lose her again. When he reached the spot where he last saw her, she was gone. A knot formed in his throat. It couldn't be just a coincidence. That child had something unsettling about him. Daniel stood still, trying to calm his racing pulse. His eyes hadn't deceived him. The boy had his eyes. What would you do if you saw your ex-partner with a child who looked exactly like you? Tell us your first reaction in the comments below. The haunting eyes and a relentless search. Another one? Asked Mark Thompson, his partner and best friend, tilting his head. Daniel took a gulp of his whiskey and nodded. They were in his penthouse in Manhattan, the city lights glittering beyond the windows. "I saw her, Mark, there, at the airport." Mark put his glass down. "Are you sure? You think I wouldn't recognize her?" Daniel ran a hand through his hair, frustrated. It was her, and she was carrying a child. A child. Daniel closed his eyes. "He had my eyes, Mark." Silence hung heavy. "Are you saying that?" "I don't know," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "But I can't get it out of my head. Did you try to talk to her?" "I tried. She disappeared, as always." Mark sighed and rubbed his chin. "Look, buddy, if you think that child could be yours, you have to find out. You can't just sit around waiting for destiny to send you the answer." Daniel clenched his jaw. "I don't know where to find her." Mark watched him for a moment and then smiled ironically. "Don't mess with me. You're Daniel Brooks. If anyone can find a person, it's you." That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. He sat in his study, staring at his laptop screen, but not reading the pending emails. Amelia. He hadn't seen her in 3 years. 3 years without a single damn explanation. He remembered the day she disappeared. There were no prior arguments, no signs that anything was wrong. Just a terse text message. "I'm sorry. I can't do this anymore." He had tried to find her at first, but there was no trace, as if she had been swallowed by the earth. Now, out of nowhere, she reappeared with a child who had his very own eyes. He lit a cigarette, something he only did when his mind was on the verge of collapse. He couldn't leave this unresolved. He was going to find her. And this time, he wouldn't let her escape without answers. A familiar face in a small town. "You don't look good, Daniel." Mark crossed his arms as he watched him. They were in the offices of Brooks Capital, the investment fund they had built together over the last decade. Daniel had been looking lost and frowning for days, which for anyone who knew him meant he was on the verge of exploding. "I haven't slept well." "Tell me about it," Mark smirked. "Have you found anything?" Daniel took out his cell phone and impatiently swiped the screen. "I called some contacts, but I don't have anything yet. No one knows about her." "And why don't you try looking for her yourself?" "Because I don't know where to start." Mark scoffed. "Brother, stop messing with your head and do what you would do with any other investment. Look for information. Didn't you have contacts in a smaller town, like upstate New York? You said she was from there, right?" Daniel fell silent. "Maybe someone has seen her. A friend. An old contact. What do you have to lose by trying?" Daniel sighed. "Nothing." "Exactly. So get your butt in gear and start looking." That afternoon, Daniel drove to a small town upstate. As he drove, his mind spun out of control. The child. Ever since he saw him, the image had stuck to him like a splinter. He couldn't stop thinking about his eyes. His mother always said the Brooks family had an unmistakable gaze, that intense blue rarely seen. If Amelia had had a child, why did she never tell him? If he was his, why did she hide something like that from him? He gripped the steering wheel tightly. The idea that she could have hidden something so important from him filled him with rage. But there was also fear. Fear of discovering that he had lost 3 years of his son's life. The search in the town was harder than he imagined. He asked in cafes, bookstores, and even universities, but no one seemed to know her. Until he reached a small restaurant near the town square. "Amelia Green," he asked the waitress, showing her an old photo on his cell phone. The woman frowned, as if trying to remember. "I think I've seen her. She comes sometimes with her boy." Daniel's heart raced. "Do you know where she lives?" "No, but she usually comes in the afternoons." Daniel ordered a coffee and waited. The clock read 6 when Amelia entered the restaurant. Daniel saw her before she noticed him. She was wearing a gray coat, the same one she had at the airport. She walked quickly, as if she was used to surveying her surroundings. And there he was, the child, Leo. She held his hand, and Daniel's blood froze. The resemblance was impossible to ignore. He stood up just as Amelia looked up and saw him. Her eyes widened in shock. "What are you doing here?" she whispered. "I could ask you the same thing." The tension was unbearable. Amelia straightened up, as if she wanted to block her reaction. "It's not the time. You've been hiding from me for 3 years. I think any time is a good time." She pressed her lips together. "I have nothing to say to you." Daniel let out a bitter laugh. "Seriously?" He looked at the child. "Nothing to say to me?" Amelia swallowed and looked around nervously. "Don't do this here." Daniel leaned towards her, his voice low and tense. "Is that child mine?" Amelia felt the world crashing down on her. What do you think Amelia will say or do next? Will she reveal the truth or continue to hide? Share your thoughts in the comments. The unspoken truth and a mother's confession. Amelia felt her throat close up. The restaurant seemed to have fallen silent. The weight of Daniel's question was unbearable, and although her instinct screamed at her to run, she knew that this time she wouldn't be able to escape. Amelia. His voice was low, contained, but dangerous. Answer me. She swallowed and looked at Leo, who was playing with a plastic spoon on the table. Not here, she whispered. Daniel let out a bitter laugh. Then where? Because it seems that if I don't run into you by chance, you were never going to tell me. Amelia felt the burning in her eyes, but forced herself to remain firm. My place. Daniel watched her, hesitating. It's not a trap, she said wearily. He nodded distrustfully. Let's go. Amelia's apartment was small, 2 sparsely furnished rooms. Daniel looked around without saying anything, but his expression said it all. You lived like this with my son? Leo fell asleep on the sofa as soon as they arrived. Daniel stared at him intently. Is he mine? He asked again, directly. Amelia felt her stomach knot. Yes. The word hung in the air. Daniel let out a sigh, as if he had been punched in the chest. He ran his hands over his face, and then walked to the window, turning his back to her. How long have you known? Since the beginning. And you never thought of telling me? I couldn't. Daniel turned sharply. You couldn't? Why? Amelia closed her eyes for a second before speaking. Your mother forced me to leave. Daniel's face hardened. What? When I found out I was pregnant, I tried to tell you, but Eleanor got to me first. She told me you were no longer interested in me, that you were with another woman. Daniel's eyes widened in fury. That's a lie. I know, but at that moment I didn't know, and she offered me money to disappear so I wouldn't cause you problems. Did you accept? No. Amelia lifted her chin. I left because she made me doubt, because I felt displaced before I could even talk to you. Daniel felt his blood boil. I can't believe my mother would do that. Amelia looked down. I didn't expect you to. The silence between them was thick. I need a moment, he said, walking away towards the door. Daniel, she called. He stopped but didn't turn around. I'm not leaving, he said firmly. Leo is my son. I'm not disappearing. And he left, leaving Amelia with a lump in her throat. The unseen years and a fierce resolve. Daniel walked aimlessly through the streets of the small town, his mind spinning out of control. His mother, Eleanor Brooks, had always been a manipulative woman, but he never thought she would go this far. Manipulating Amelia, making her believe he had forgotten her, and worst of all, hiding his own son from him. He leaned against a wall and closed his eyes, breathing deeply. Leo. Now everything made sense. From the moment he saw the child, he knew there was something more, something that couldn't just be a coincidence. Now he had the certainty. He was his son. 3 years. 3 damned years that had been stolen from his life. He felt a fierce rage, a need to confront his mother instantly. But he knew he first had to resolve something more important. Amelia. She had kept him away. Yes, but now he understood why. And although his anger was still there, he also knew he couldn't afford to keep losing time with his son. He took out his phone and dialed. Mark, now what did you do? I have a son. There was a long silence. Tell me it's not a joke. It's not. His name is Leo. Amelia hid him from me, but not of her own accord. It was my mother. Mark let out an expletive. Damn it, Dan. What are you going to do? Daniel looked at the dark sky over the town. I'm going to meet my son. When he returned to Amelia's apartment, she was still sitting on the sofa, her hands clasped. "I thought you wouldn't come back," she said without looking at him. "I'm not that kind of person." She let out a dry laugh. "I didn't know what kind of person you were when I left." He clenched his jaw. "That doesn't matter anymore. What matters is Leo." Amelia nodded slowly. "He's asleep." Daniel looked at the room where his son rested. His son. He still couldn't believe it. "I want to see him." She hesitated for a moment, but finally stood up and opened the door carefully. The room was small, barely lit by a nightlight. Leo slept with a relaxed face, hugging a worn teddy bear. Daniel approached slowly. He knelt beside the bed and watched him closely. Every feature, every tiny gesture was his. He felt a lump in his throat. 3 years. 3 years of not seeing him grow, of not hearing his first word, of not knowing anything about him. And that wasn't going to continue. He turned to Amelia, his voice barely a whisper. "I'm not going to lose any more time with him." She looked at him, with something that seemed like sadness in her eyes. "I know." Daniel stayed there, watching his son sleep. Nothing in the world would take him away from him again. "I want to be in his life." The slow dance of trust. Amelia closed Leo's bedroom door carefully and stood with her back to Daniel. His voice still resonated in her head. He didn't say it as a plea or as a negotiation. He said it with the certainty of a man who had made an irrevocable decision. She took a deep breath before turning around. "I don't know how to do this." Daniel looked at her sternly. "Me neither, but we're going to find a way." The silence between them was long, uncomfortable. "You can't just show up and make decisions," Amelia finally said. "It's not a decision. It's a right. He's my son." Amelia clenched her fists. "And what do you want to do? Move in here? Burst into his life and change everything?" "I don't want to hurt him," he replied, controlling his anger. "But I can't act as if nothing happened." She ran a hand over her face. "I'm not ready for this, Daniel." "Well, you'd better get ready," he blurted out, "because I'm not disappearing." Amelia fell silent, looking at him with a mixture of fear and resignation. She knew he meant it. Daniel stayed in the small town. He rented an apartment in the center, small but comfortable. He didn't want to pressure Amelia or Leo, but he also didn't intend to stay away. The first few days were difficult. Amelia set strict boundaries. She let him see Leo, but always with her present. No impromptu visits, no sudden changes. Daniel accepted the rules, at least for now. He knew he had to earn her trust. More importantly, he had to earn his son's trust. "Who are you?" Leo asked, looking at him curiously. It was the first time they were alone, even if only for a few minutes, while Amelia prepared coffee in the kitchen. Daniel smiled nervously. "I'm Daniel. Are you my mom's friend?" Daniel swallowed. "Something like that." Leo frowned, thoughtful. "You talk like me." Daniel let out a laugh. "How so?" "Fast and serious," the boy said, shrugging. Daniel felt a strange warmth in his chest. Maybe because we're alike. Leo stared at him, as if trying to find something in his face. "Are you going to come often?" "If your mom lets me, yes." The boy studied him a little longer, and then nodded naturally. "Okay." Daniel smiled. He knew he still had a long way to go, but at least he had taken the first step. "You can't expect everything to be easy." Amelia had her arms crossed as she looked at Daniel from the doorway. Leomas had just fallen asleep after spending the afternoon with his father, and the atmosphere between them was tense. Daniel took a deep breath. "I don't expect it to be easy, but I'm not going to stand by and watch from the sidelines either." She shook her head, exhausted. "You don't understand how complicated this is. Leo has only had BD. His world is small, safe, and now suddenly you appear. Because you were always supposed to be here. He interrupted her firmly. And don't tell me it wasn't my decision because I already know that. But now it is. Amelia lowered her gaze, biting her lip. Do you really think this is solved just by wanting to be here? Daniel crossed his arms. How do you want me to do it then? That I leave and wait for an invitation years from now? No, Amelia. I'm not going to make that mistake. She pressed her lips together, struggling with her thoughts. I don't want Leo to suffer, she murmured. Neither do I. There was a long silence between them. Finally, Amelia sighed. All right, we'll try, but at my pace. The only thing I want is for you to let me be his father. Amelia's eyes darkened for an instant. That's something that will take time. Daniel nodded. I'm in no hurry. She didn't believe him. She knew Daniel Brooks had never been a patient man. The following days were strange. Daniel spent more time with Leo, naturally gaining his trust. Despite the years of distance, the boy seemed to accept him easily. But not everything was so simple. Every time Daniel held him, every time Leo sought him out with excitement, Amelia felt a mixture of relief and fear. Relief because her son deserved a father. Fear because she didn't know how much longer she could keep the chaos this brought into her life under control. A mother's threat and a father's stand. And then, one afternoon, chaos found her first. Amelia was at the market when she felt a chill. She knew that feeling, that pressure in her chest, that certainty that something was wrong. She turned slowly, and there she was, Eleanor Brooks. The woman was impeccable as always, her hair perfectly styled, and her elegant posture, even though the market was not the type of place where one would expect to find her. Amelia felt her blood run cold. I can't believe you're here, Eleanor said with a calm voice, but sharp as a knife. Amelia clenched her fists. I'm not doing this. She turned to leave, but Eleanor stopped her with a subtle movement, barely a brush on her arm. Not so fast, she whispered. You haven't forgotten what we talked about 3 years ago, have you? Amelia felt nauseous. You lied to me. You told me Daniel had another life, that he didn't care. Eleanor smiled humorlessly. And wasn't it easier that way? For everyone. For you. Not for us. Eleanor's eyes hardened. Don't make this more difficult, Amelia. Difficult for whom? For you? For Leo, Eleanor said softly. Don't think Daniel can handle this. His life isn't made for a child. Do you really want your son to go through everything it means to be a Brooks? Amelia felt a lump in her throat. I don't care what you think. You should, because if you continue with this, he'll take him from you. Fear hit her like a punch. He wouldn't. Are you not sure? Because I am. Amelia felt her heart race. Eleanor looked at her calmly, as if she already knew she had won. I'm going to give you one chance, Amelia, to do the right thing. Amelia felt the trembling in her hands, but didn't let it show. I'm not leaving, Eleanor sighed. Then get ready to lose. And without another word, she walked away. Amelia stood there, feeling the ground sink beneath her feet, because she knew Eleanor Brooks did not make empty threats. Amelia closed her apartment door, her heart pounding. Her hands had been cold for hours since her encounter with Eleanor. She couldn't get her words out of her head, her calculating tone, the certainty with which she had said, he'll take him from you. She leaned her back against the door and took a deep breath. She couldn't panic. She couldn't afford to tremble. Her instinct screamed at her to run, that she had to disappear before Eleanor carried out her threat. But she couldn't. Leo already knew Daniel. He already saw him as someone important in his life. Leaving again was not an option, but neither could she stand idly by. Daniel arrived the next day, knowing nothing. What's wrong? He asked as soon as he saw her. Amelia couldn't completely hide it. She looked more tense, more tired. Nothing, she replied, looking away. Daniel frowned. Don't lie to me. Something happened. Amelia hesitated for a moment. She wasn't sure if she should tell him, but then she remembered that Daniel wasn't the same man as 3 years ago. Your mother came to see me. Daniel fell silent. His gaze changed immediately. What did she say? That I should leave, that I should do the right thing. Daniel let out a low laugh, but not of amusement. Of course she did. Amelia crossed her arms. She was serious, Daniel. I know, but I also know I'm not going to let her win. Amelia felt a chill. It's not a game. Daniel looked at her intently. Do you think I don't know that? The atmosphere between them was heavy, but neither looked away. Leave it to me, he finally said. I'll fix this. Amelia let out an incredulous laugh. You can't fix your mother, but I can make sure she doesn't come near you again. Amelia looked at him, doubting. How? Daniel smiled, but it was a cold smile. Leave it to me. The showdown and a calculated retreat. Daniel didn't waste time. He called her that same afternoon. Mother, Daniel said. Alexander, Eleanor replied calmly. What a surprise. We'll skip the pleasantries. I know you spoke with Amelia. Eleanor said nothing for a moment. Then her tone changed. I did it because I'm worried. Daniel clenched his jaw. Don't give me that. You did it because you hate not being in control. I'm thinking about your future. No, he interrupted her. You're thinking about yours. There was a long silence. That child doesn't fit into your life, Daniel. Daniel felt something break inside him. Are you really saying that? I'm not saying you don't want him. I'm saying he's not part of what you've built. Daniel closed his eyes and took a deep breath. Listen carefully, Mom. I'm going to make this clear so there are no misunderstandings. Leo is my son, and you will not interfere in his life or mine again. Eleanor sighed. Don't be dramatic. I'm not. I'm setting boundaries. That's what you think. But in the end, Daniel, you always come back to me. Not this time. Eleanor remained silent, and for the first time in his life, Daniel felt that she didn't have the upper hand. Do what you want, she said coldly, but don't be surprised when things get complicated. Things are already complicated, and even so, I prefer this rather than continuing to be the obedient son you want. He hung up before she could reply. For the first time, he felt he had landed the first blow, but he knew Eleanor Brooks would not stand idly by. Daniel closed his eyes and exhaled sharply. He had just defied Eleanor Brooks, something very few had done without consequences. But this time, he wasn't going to back down. He ran a hand over his face and then looked at his phone. He had to focus on what was important. Amelia. The last thing he wanted was for his son to suffer because of his mother's manipulations. He had to strengthen his relationship with him. He had to show Amelia that he was here to stay. And he knew exactly how to start. Do you want us 3 to go together? Amelia frowned, surprised by Daniel's proposal. Just to the park, he clarified. I'm not saying we should move in together. Amelia crossed her arms. Why do you suddenly want to do this? Because I want to get to know Leo in his own environment, without him feeling like I'm forcing him into something. She sighed, hesitating. Daniel didn't blame her, but after a long silence, she nodded. All right. The park was full of children running and playing on the swings. Leo let go of his mother's hand and approached with curiosity. Daniel followed him with his gaze, not knowing quite what to do. You've never dealt with children, have you? Amelia asked softly. Daniel let out a dry laugh. No. It shows. She watched him for a moment, and then sighed. Just follow him. Let him set the pace. Daniel didn't answer, but walked to where Leo was playing in the sand. What are you building? Leo replied, not looking up. Can I help you? The boy looked up, thoughtful, and then nodded. Daniel knelt down and picked up some sand, not knowing exactly what to do with it. Not like that, Leo said impatiently. First you have to make a base. Daniel smiled unknowingly. And how do I do that? Leo sighed as if he were talking to an absolute beginner. I'll show you. And for the next half hour, Daniel listened carefully to each of his instructions. Amelia watched them from afar. She saw the way Leo spoke without fear, how Daniel listened patiently, how he laughed at the small things. She never imagined seeing them like this, and against all odds, her son seemed to trust him naturally. That was what scared her the most, because if Leo started to love him, if he started to see him as part of his life, she couldn't afford to lose Daniel again. Because if he left again, this time he wouldn't only break her heart, he would also break his son's. The slow bloom of trust. Amelia couldn't stop watching them. Daniel and Leo were still in the sand, now trying to build a tower taller than the previous one. Leo laughed every time the structure collapsed, while Daniel feigned frustration. It was a simple scene, but the feeling it provoked in Amelia was anything but simple. It was fear, not because Daniel was failing, but because he seemed to be doing too well. Too well. Every day, Leo became more accustomed to his presence, sought him out with more confidence, no longer seemed shy when Daniel arrived, and although Amelia knew it was what should happen, she couldn't ignore the worry that gnawed at her chest. What would happen if Daniel got tired? If he decided this was too much for him? If, after all, he ended up being just a visitor in Leo's life? Are you tense again? Daniel's voice pulled her from her thoughts. He stood in front of her, with Leo running around the yard. Amelia looked away. I'm fine. No, you're not, he said directly. What's wrong? She took a moment to respond. I'm scared, she confessed softly. Daniel narrowed his eyes. Of what? Amelia swallowed before looking at him. That this won't last. Daniel's face hardened. I'm not leaving. You say that now. I say that because it's the truth. Amelia shook her head. Daniel, you have another life. Businesses, trips, commitments. I don't know how long you can keep this up. Daniel crossed his arms. And what if I tell you that I'm not leaving? That I'm not just here for a while? Amelia looked at him with a mixture of skepticism and a desire to believe him. I don't know if I can risk trusting that. Daniel took a step closer, his voice lower, but firm. It's not just about you, Amelia. It's about Leo. She felt a lump in her chest. I know, she whispered. But that's precisely what scares me the most. The following days, Amelia tried to act normal. She didn't want to let her fear sabotage everything, but Daniel was perceptive. He watched her, noticed when she drifted off, when she seemed to hesitate every time Leo hugged him with excitement. And one day, after putting Leo to sleep, she couldn't take it anymore. Tell me the truth, Amelia. She looked up from the teacup she held in the kitchen. About what? Daniel looked at her seriously. About what's really bothering you. Amelia put the cup on the table and sighed. I don't want Leo to get attached to you if you're not sure you're going to stay. Daniel placed his hands on the table, looking at her intently. Amelia, this is not a game for me. You say that now. Daniel clicked his tongue impatiently. I'm not a child. I'm not doing this on a whim. I'm here because I want to be here. Amelia held his gaze, feeling her heart beating too fast. And what if one day you decide you can't do it anymore? He straightened up. Then tell me what I have to do to prove to you that I'm not leaving. Amelia felt her throat close up, because she had no answer, because part of her didn't want one, and because she knew that if he kept insisting, she would end up falling. Daniel didn't bring up the topic again, but Amelia knew his answer still floated between them. He was determined to stay. She was afraid he would leave, and in the middle of it all was Leo, more and more comfortable with his presence. The days passed, and Daniel started picking him up from school when Amelia had work. Some afternoons, he would take him for ice cream. Others, they would just sit in the park and play. It was so natural, so simple, so dangerous, because for the first time Amelia started to imagine a future where Daniel was really there, not just as a temporary visitor, and that terrified her. One night, when Leo was already asleep, Daniel stayed in the apartment longer than usual. "Want some coffee?" Amelia asked, not realizing how strange it sounded. He looked at her with a faint smile. "Is that your way of telling me not to leave yet?" Amelia fell silent. She hadn't even thought about it, but when she realized she didn't want him to leave, her stomach churned. Daniel approached the table and sat across from her. "Tell me what's wrong." Amelia looked down. "Nothing." "Amelia." She pressed her lips together and looked him in the eyes. "I don't know what to do with you." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "I didn't know I was a problem." Amelia sighed. "You are, because you're here. Because Leo is getting used to you. Because I—" She stopped, feeling her heart pound in her chest. Daniel didn't look away. "You what?" Amelia swallowed and looked away. "It doesn't matter." Daniel leaned over the table. "It does matter." Amelia felt the room getting smaller, that Daniel was too close, that her feelings were too out of control. "I'm scared that this is starting to feel normal," she finally admitted. Daniel tilted his head. "Why?" She let out a dry laugh. "Because if this becomes normal, it means we could lose it." Daniel looked at her in silence for a long moment. Then, with a calm but firm voice, he said, "We're not going to lose anything." Amelia couldn't answer, because deep down, a part of her wanted to believe him, and that was what scared her the most. A year of normalcy and a promise kept. Daniel couldn't stop thinking about Amelia's words. "I'm scared that this is starting to feel normal." There was something in her voice when she said it. Not just fear, but also something deeper, something he couldn't name. He didn't want to pressure her anymore that night. He knew that forcing her would only make her shut down even more. But he was clear that Amelia felt something she was trying to avoid at all costs. And Daniel, for the first time in a long time, was not willing to let it go. The days continued. Leo waited for him excitedly every time he picked him up from school. Every time he saw him smile, Daniel felt something inside him solidify more. That child was his blood, and he couldn't believe he had almost been taken from him. But the most difficult part wasn't Leo. It was Amelia. She continued to keep her distance, although it was clear it was hard for her to do so. Every time their hands brushed while walking next to Leo, every time they were alone in the kitchen and the silence grew thick, Daniel noticed how her breathing changed. But she did nothing, and he was already tired of waiting. One afternoon, after putting Leo to sleep, Amelia went out onto the balcony for some air. Daniel followed her. "How long are you going to keep running from this?" She immediately tensed. "What are you talking about?" Daniel rested his hands on the railing, looking at the city. "Us." Amelia turned abruptly. "There is no us, Daniel." He smiled ironically. "Do you really believe that?" "It's the truth." "It's not." Amelia pressed her lips together. "Daniel, we can't." "Why not?" he interrupted. "Because you're scared?" She looked away. "It's not fear." "Of course it is. I don't want Leo to get confused," she said softly. Daniel stared at her intently. "Or you don't want to get confused yourself." The silence between them was unbearable. Amelia felt her pulse quicken. Daniel was too close, his voice too firm, too confident, and she was losing the battle she had tried to fight since he came back. Then, without thinking too much, she said the only thing she had left. "This isn't going to work." Daniel didn't move. "Why?" Amelia closed her eyes for an instant before replying. "Because I don't know how to trust you again." Daniel inhaled slowly. He didn't get angry. He didn't argue. He just nodded. "Then tell me how to do it." She looked at him in surprise. "What? Tell me how to make you trust me again." Amelia felt a lump in her throat, because she had no answer, because part of her didn't want one, and because she knew that if he kept insisting, she would end up falling. Daniel didn't pressure her after that night on the balcony, but Amelia knew he was waiting. He didn't say it. He didn't show it, obviously. But she saw it in his eyes every time they were close, in the patience with which he treated her, in the way he left space for her to make the decision. And the worst part was that, with each passing day, she felt her own defenses weaken. But then, everything changed. Daniel received the call when he least expected it. He was in his office reviewing some reports when his phone rang. He didn't recognize the number, but he answered immediately. "Mr. Brooks?" The voice on the other end of the line sounded formal, but with a hint of urgency. "Yes, who is this?" "I'm your mother's lawyer." Daniel felt his blood boil. What the hell does she want now? There was a brief silence before the lawyer continued. "I just wanted to inform you that Mrs. Eleanor Brooks has initiated legal proceedings to obtain custody of your son." The air seemed to leave his lungs. "What did you say?" "Mrs. Brooks has argued that you and the child's mother are unfit to raise him. She has requested an evaluation to determine if Leo would be better under her care." Daniel's heart pounded with fury. "This is insane." "I know, sir," the lawyer said in a neutral tone, "but the petition is already underway." Daniel was speechless. He couldn't believe it. He knew his mother wouldn't give up easily, but he never thought she would go this far. And the worst part was that now he had to tell Amelia. When he arrived at the apartment, Amelia opened the door with a frown. "What's wrong?" she asked instantly. Daniel wasted no time. "We have a problem." Amelia felt a chill. "What happened?" "My mother filed a lawsuit to get Leo." The world stopped. "No, she can't do that," Amelia whispered, feeling short of breath. "Yes, she can, and she's doing it." Amelia leaned against the wall. "No, this can't be happening." Daniel took her by the shoulders, forcing her to look at him. "I'm going to stop her. I'm not going to let her take our son." But Amelia barely heard him. Her worst fear had come true. Eleanor had fulfilled her threat. And now if they didn't do something, they could lose everything. Amelia felt her legs tremble. The world was crumbling around her, but Daniel held her firmly by the shoulders. "Look at me," he said in a harsh voice. "We're going to fix this." "How?" she whispered, fear reflected in her eyes. "It's Eleanor. She's powerful. She has money, contacts, lawyers. And I do too," Daniel interrupted. "I'm not going to let her win." But Amelia couldn't breathe. Her whole body was on alert, as if her instinct was screaming at her to run before it was too late. "We need a plan," Daniel continued. "We can't act impulsively." Amelia rubbed her temples. "We can't let this go to trial." "It won't." Amelia looked at him in disbelief. "Daniel, your mother doesn't play fair." "I know," he said coldly. "And that's why I'm going to confront her way." The next few days were chaos. Daniel contacted his trusted lawyers and prepared his defense. Amelia met with specialists to prove that Leo was fine with her, but anxiety wouldn't let her sleep. Every day she expected to receive a notification, a legal blow that would put them against the ropes, and when it came, it wasn't what she expected. A letter delivered to her door. "You have one last chance to do the right thing. Don't make this harder for everyone. See you tomorrow at 10 a.m. Eleanor." Amelia felt her blood run cold. "You're not going alone," Daniel said, as soon as he read the letter. "I'm not going at all," Amelia replied angrily. "If you don't go, you'll just give her more reasons to attack us." Amelia clenched her fists. "I'm not going to let her manipulate me again." Daniel looked at her seriously. "That's why I'm going with you." She hesitated. She knew confronting Eleanor was a risk, but she also knew they couldn't keep running. The meeting was at an elegant restaurant, away from the city. Eleanor was already waiting when they arrived. She was dressed as always, impeccable, with an expression of calm superiority. "I see you've brought reinforcements," she said with a sharp smile. Daniel sat across from her. "Cut the crap, Mom." Eleanor sighed with feigned disappointment. "Always so aggressive." Amelia crossed her arms. "Tell us what you want." Eleanor looked at them coldly. "I want what's best for Leo." Daniel let out a dry laugh. "And you're what's best?" "Of course." Amelia felt like screaming. "You don't care about him. You just want to control everything." Eleanor gave her a bored look. "What I want is to spare him a life of mediocrity." "Do you really think you can give him what he needs?" Amelia's stomach churned. "My son is not an object for you to decide what to do with him." Eleanor calmly took a sip of her coffee. "What he is a Brooks, and that means he deserves more than you can give him." Daniel looked at her with contained fury. "You're not going to touch him." Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "And what are you going to do to stop me?" Silence spread between them. Amelia felt the fear in her skin. Eleanor never made empty threats. And the worst part was that he knew it. The war had just begun. Daniel clenched his fists under the table. "You're not going to win, Mom." Eleanor looked at him with an almost amused smile. "And who's going to stop me? You?" "Yes." His tone was so cold and firm that for the first time Eleanor's expression changed. Amelia saw the woman's eyes narrow slightly. She knew she was calculating. She was measuring her own son as if he were a pawn in her game. "You have no idea what you're doing," Eleanor finally said. Daniel rested his elbows on the table and spoke calmly. "Neither do you." The woman raised an eyebrow, as if amused by his bravery. "Enlighten me." Daniel took a deep breath and looked her directly in the eyes. "If you take this to court, I'll go public." Eleanor smiled, but there was a shadow in her gaze. "And you think that scares me? It doesn't scare you, but it makes you uncomfortable. And you hate being uncomfortable, don't you?" Amelia tensed. Daniel was right. Eleanor Brooks built her reputation on an image of an unblemished woman, a benefactor, an unbreakable businesswoman. A scandal of this magnitude would put the press all over her. Daniel continued without giving her time to respond. "I have proof of everything, of how you interfered in my private life, of how you manipulated Amelia to leave. And if you decide to go ahead with this, I swear every damn newspaper and every news outlet in this country will find out." Eleanor narrowed her eyes. "That will also affect you." "I prefer that, rather than you touching my son." The silence was heavy. Amelia felt her heart pound in her chest. Eleanor slowly turned her head towards her. "You approve of this?" Amelia didn't look away. "I don't need to approve of it. Leo is mine. And Daniel's, not yours." Eleanor smiled mockingly. "You have no idea the mistake you're making." Daniel crossed his arms. "We'll see." There was a long silence. Then Eleanor elegantly stood up and took her purse. "I'll think about it." Daniel and Amelia watched her walk away without saying a word, but they both knew that this war was not over yet. The next few days were hell. Every hour Amelia expected to receive notification of the lawsuit. Every call she received made her heart jump. But days passed, and nothing came. Eleanor made no move, until, out of nowhere, Daniel received a message. Enjoy your victory, but remember, Daniel, there's always more than one way to win. Amelia felt a chill when he showed her the screen. What do you think it means? She asked in a whisper. Daniel clenched his jaw. It means that for now, she'll leave us alone. Amelia sighed, but her body remained tense. I don't like this. Daniel looked at her seriously. Me neither, but for the first time in my life, I think I beat my mother. And although fear still surrounded them, they knew they had crossed a line from which Eleanor could no longer return. No matter what she tried next, Leo was still with them, and that was all that mattered. This is such a gripping turn of events. Do you think Eleanor is truly defeated, or is she plotting something new? What do you think Daniel and Amelia's next steps should be? Share your predictions in the comments below. A year of normalcy. The air felt lighter in the following days. After weeks of tension, Eleanor had retreated. There were no more letters, no more threats, no more attempts at manipulation. But Amelia wasn't completely calm. She can't give up that easily, she said one night while making coffee in the kitchen. Daniel, sitting at the table, watched her calmly. It's not surrender, it's strategy. Amelia turned her head with a frown. What do you mean? Daniel shrugged. That she won't do anything now because it's not convenient for her. But that doesn't mean she has accepted defeat. She felt a chill. That doesn't give me peace. She's not going to give it to you. But the difference is that now we know what we're up against. Amelia sighed and leaned her hands on the counter. And what if one day she tries again? Daniel stood up and walked to her. Then we'll be ready. She closed her eyes for a moment. She felt like she had been waiting for an attack for so long that now that the battle seemed to be over, her body didn't know how to relax. Daniel noticed, and for the first time in a long time, he took her hand without her pulling away. Amelia. She looked at him and saw something in his eyes she hadn't seen before, something that made her feel safe. I'm not going to let anything happen to you or to Leo. Amelia felt a lump in her throat. I don't want this to just be a war against your mother, Daniel. It's not. There was a long silence. Daniel gently squeezed her hand. You said you didn't know how to trust me again. Amelia swallowed. Yes. And now? She looked down for a moment. Now I'm not sure. Daniel smiled, but not mockingly, but with patience. That's progress. She let out a dry laugh. Maybe. Daniel watched her in silence before letting go of her hand. I'll wait. Amelia looked at him in surprise. Wait for what? Until you're sure. And before she could respond, he walked away with a calm smile, leaving Amelia with a strange feeling in her chest, because for the first time she also wanted to wait. Because for the first time, she believed that maybe, just maybe, they could have a future together. A park, a promise, a real family. A year later, Amelia stopped at the park entrance and watched the scene in front of her. Leo ran across the grass, laughing out loud as Daniel chased him. I'm gonna get you, Daniel shouted with that playful voice he only used with his son. Leo shrieked with excitement and sped up, but his father caught him easily and lifted him into the air. No! Yes! Both laughed as if the world was only theirs. Amelia felt a pang in her chest, of happiness, of relief, of something she didn't dare to name, because after everything they had been through, after so many doubts and fears, they were here. Daniel noticed her watching and gave her a smile, one that didn't demand answers, one that simply said, I'm here. Amelia approached and sat on their usual bench. Leo ran to her and hugged her legs. Mommy, Daddy runs super fast. Amelia ruffled his hair. That's because he has long legs. Daniel dropped down beside her, breathing deeply. "I'm too old for this." Amelia let out a laugh. "You're such a drama queen." He smiled sideways. "You haven't seen me when my back hurts yet." She shook her head and looked at Leo, who was already playing with the dirt. "He's happy." Daniel looked at her gently. "We are too." Amelia felt the warmth in her chest. A year ago, she would never have imagined this moment. Not with Daniel. Not with the family they had rebuilt. But here they were. Not with a perfect ending. Not with a guaranteed forever. But with something much more real. With the promise to keep trying. This beautiful story of healing, trust, and the true meaning of family has reached its emotional conclusion. If you were moved by Daniel and Amelia's journey, please give this video a like and share it with someone who needs a reminder that love can truly conquer all. And for more inspiring tales of resilience and connection, subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell.